Hello everybody and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here and I'm joined by Don as usual. Today we're going to be talking about differences between personal and individual choices and freedoms and how to balance that with collective and social decision making. So you want to get us started here, Don? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in sort of contemporary liberal debates on these kind of things, it's sort of like the dominant mode of how people debate these things in the United States, and sort of as an extension of that because of their economy and stuff like worldwide. Like the debate tends to be something like, okay, should something be legal? Should it be, should it be something that we allow, even theoretically, kind of thing, like as a society, like something like, say, marijuana or something like that kind of thing. We'll just as an example.
Sure.
And then if you say, well, I don't have much of an opinion on it should be legal or not, like maybe it should be legal, but I don't think you should do it. The sort of knee-jerk reaction from people is kind of like, well, then shut up and don't do it and leave me alone kind of thing, right? And I think that transcends both the right and the left on a lot of this kind of stuff. Like that's kind of like that libertarian kind of impulse is there. And the difference for me, I mean, when I'm thinking about this, is I do think about it in some economic terms, because with something like in the future, like socialist planning or something like that, or even just, I mean, the problem still exists today is like, what kind of things do you want production to go into? Like, what kind of things do you want your economy making? And those things, those involve trade-offs, and I mean, they currently involve trade-offs at the very least, like, where it's stuff like, okay, well, do you want your economy to put so much resources into building and distributing marijuana or something like that versus some other, use for that social time and social resources and stuff. And
like poppies for heroin or something like that.
Yeah. And at some level, like a centrally planned economy has to have, or any sort of socialist economy doesn't matter if you pretend that if it's centrally planned or not, but like it has to kind of have like a budget line for that kind of stuff, like at some level, like how much heroin do you think that the Soviets should produce or something like that, like it's like that. It's just that's just a natural thing, and that exists in our society, but we kind of filter it through money. So it's kind of like, well, if you don't want it, just don't buy it kind of thing. But I think that it's interesting because there's a lot of things where that libertarian impulse conflicts with people's moral, opinions about what the kind of things should be allowed in different ways, especially when there's like overriding other concerns. And I think that people get especially liberals get a certain kind of like excitement around finding those exemptions and stuff, like, because of like, say, climate change, or because of maybe they have vegetarian opinions or something like that kind of thing, like trying to find ways of saying, I support the freedom to do this, but because of animal rights or whatever, we can't have this kind of production and stuff. And
right,
the intuition that we could avoid these decisions by sort of dispersing them out to individuals and saying, well, if you don't want to do it, then don't do it. That tends to be my reaction to most of this stuff too. But it's not really, at the end of the day, it's not the actual. Like you have to have an actual opinion on for yourself and maybe for your loved ones, and and at some level for the community at large, like what kind of things do you want to emphasize? What kind of things do you want to kind of make up your community in different ways? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's deeply ingrained. I think it's at such a deep level that even when you feel some kind of you have some different sort of competing ideology in your head, I think it tends to like predominate, like whether you're like, you were talking about how like liberals and conservatives both think of this the same way. I think that's true, but in both cases there are things that sort of contradict that in different ways. Like conservatives might have different social attitudes about different things that they would rather like oppose or whatever, but then they kind of concede to the sort of like libertarian of like, well, if it doesn't bother you, just don't leave it alone, don't do it, but it's none of your business kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And liberals have the same things with, like, especially I think around like feminist or women's issues and stuff. I think this stuff comes up, and yeah, gun control, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then even like if you're the most like trad religious, based whatever kind of guy in the world, I think this stuff still, like, it's very hard to get out from under it. Like I have, like, it weighs very heavy on my mind. I'm not trying to present myself as like the most trad guy in the world or whatever, but like I feel like that's never going to go away from me. That's going to always be some sort of like background thing, and I don't even think it's like a bad principle, really. Like, I think in many cases it makes a lot of sense to kind of treat people this way, and even at a collective level, in many cases, I think it's often the best policy. But I do think it's a little bit, maybe problematic is too strong a word, but it's like worth looking at and worth sort of critiquing. The fact that it's sort of just like this underlying assumption that we just sort of take as like a base value that supersedes everything. Anything that takes that position deserves a lot of criticism, because, like, who knows what's going on with it? They often sort of go unexamined. So two things that I thought were kind of interesting to look at here when it comes to that. The first is that I think in many different sort of cultural contexts, there are lots of things that are framed as like values and virtues of a community or a way of doing things that a certain group of people do, and they sort of become invisible. And so it, like, whether it's like a positive thing in the sense of like doing something a particular way, like positive in the sense of like, adding or affirming something, or negative in the sense of like not doing something, refraining from doing something. I think a lot of those things become sort of valorized and taken as just an assumed good thing without like a kind of rational consideration for it. It just sort of becomes like obvious in a certain kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And for us in the modern kind of context, I think this idea of this, like, if it doesn't actively violate your rights, then it's none of your business, and you can't really say anything either way about it. You just let other people do their thing. I think that takes this position, and I don't know, I've lived in different places and stuff where they have like different kinds of cultural quirks and stuff that you have to get used to, and some of them are positive, some of them are negative in that kind of sense that I'm talking about. And I think just because it was a thing that I was very young at the time, like, it always just seemed like, okay, well, I guess I just go along with this, even if it doesn't necessarily like make sense to me. It didn't really bother me when a certain country had a thing that you're not supposed to do. Like in Thailand, you're not supposed to like feet are a big thing, and touching people's, like, the top of someone's head is like extremely rude and all this kind of stuff. And that just seems like that wouldn't offend me, but I sort of understood that I shouldn't be doing that. Or even if it didn't offend the person I was doing it to, other people are going to see that and be like, what's going on there? And I think it's kind of I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but I guess like it's good to have that sort of outsider perspective on your own culture as much as you can too, kind of look at it objectively. And so like for us, I think there are certain things like that we argue it in this way of like, well, it doesn't bother me, so I'm going to let other people do it, and that's okay because it's not harming anyone, sort of a thing. But I think that we sort of define, it's a circular kind of reasoning where it's like, well, what does it mean to harm somebody? What does it mean to like that it doesn't bother you? Well, like, what are we talking about? Like, if it's something like drug use of different kinds, marijuana is a kind of a bad example here, because that's, I think, harder to prove or harder to show as an example of something that is like actively causing harm. But like alcohol or something like that, or harder drugs, there are lots of social costs to that, right? And you can say like, well, someone having a beer or a glass of wine in a restaurant and then going home, like, that's not a big deal. It doesn't really bother you. But there's like drunk driving, there's domestic violence that occurs as a result of it. There's health problems that it increases, and that incurs a social cost that everyone has to kind of accommodate. And I'm not necessarily saying those are anything like, you have to weigh the balance, right? Like there's a balance there. So I think a lot of things just sort of come under the umbrella of, well, we've determined that this doesn't harm other people in a very kind of like, it's almost like dogmatic the way that we think about it. Like there's not a way to rationally evaluate that. So we just sort of say, like, if we just say some things don't do that when you could argue that they do, right? And and then so certain things that we are allowed to do just culturally, we sort of put it into this rationalized kind of thing of like, well, we allow this because we're rational, or a rational culture. We don't have like these sort of like just inherited notions. Instead, we've determined that this doesn't harm people, so you should be allowed to do it. That's how progress works and all this kind of stuff. I just think that that's like a pretty flimsy narrative when you look at it. Like, I don't think that's really so true. I think to a large extent, it's just as like quote unquote irrational as any other culture. Like things just sort of develop for whatever reason, and it's not like there's some kind of enlightened kind of guiding principle behind it all.
I'm not sure how I feel about that exactly. I mean, I do tend to agree with a lot of the liberal sort of ideas about freedom being.
I mean, I do too. Let me be clear.
Sure.
I do too.
Yeah.
I just like the way I see people justify it, I feel is often pretty flimsy.
Yeah, I feel like maybe it's not really the optimal, like people kind of treat it as this natural thing that like this scientific process of sort of like revealing liberty over time or something, or and getting away from all the irrational prejudices and all that
Right.
kind of stuff. And I'm not sure I even disagree with that, but I think that like a lot of it is because of basically just facts about social life that we don't have much control over that we think we do sometimes, kind of thing. Like, like the inability of the government to actually enforce good laws, to in our kind of contemporary society, like to an incredible extent, really, like to not, like, and the drug war is a pretty good example of that, of, like whatever you think about whether or not the government should ban certain things, and that there is this apparatus on top of it that doesn't seem to be doing a good job of enforcing those laws, and destroying a lot more lives, maybe to some extent, and not even stopping the drug problem, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
there's stuff like that where it's like, I think that's maybe the core of the argument really is that the administration of these things causes these huge secondary problems and stuff. And you see that a lot too with things like abortion, where the mainstream of the debate in the United States tends to focus around less specific religious things, but more things like individual rights, like kind of stuff. Like people talk a lot about how the pro-life movement is very religious and things, but it doesn't. It's still, the main argument that people give is for banning abortion or something like that is it's a human life, like it's a life, like it's a person kind of thing, or something.
It's
like
still
that.
framed around the basic like libertarian non-aggression principle. Like you're taking a life without consent almost. It's like the argument against it.
It's not really the fact that like God says there shouldn't be abortion or something like that kind of thing. Like that's part of it. It's bound up in it, but it's not really. It's argued through this constitutional framework of liberalism, kind of thing, So,
right. Because like those people wouldn't argue. Generally speaking, those people don't argue against other things that are just in the Bible, like adultery or something, right? Like they don't seek to ban that. I think the trappings of religion just becomes a way of like asserting an identity within that general movement, but like both sides of the debate are really pinned on this like issue. Like the reason it's actually an issue is because you can make a sufficient like argument that's accepted within that logic of like the non-aggression principle kind of thinking,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a perfect example of this kind of stuff that has cropped up in the last few days, although I also think it's like an absurd debate in the way that it's framed, and a lot of people that are participating in it are just childish on all sides, is the question of Joe Biden receiving communion in Catholic churches, you know. And
Okay.
have you seen this at all or no?
Not really. I don't really know what the debate is.
Okay.
I know. I mean, I guess mainly from you that yeah. I guess this is a
Okay.
thing, but
Sure. So it was like, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, Twitter kind of makes your feed look like, you know, I don't know, like it reinforces what you already are following and stuff. But like, yeah, there was like millions of tweets about this kind of stuff about like back and forth. And what happened was the bishops basically, you know, there's this long-standing thing, a debate about whether or not politicians who promote abortion should be allowed to participate in mass where they receive the Eucharist, like, you know, just get the bread and wine from the priest. And that debate, you know, it's this idea of within the church, the more conservative side of the church, you know, it's this idea of, well, if we're not going to pretend that he's a Catholic in good standing if he's participating in this like practice that we consider very harmful or something like that. And that debate then becomes, it's just like a purely culture war kind of thing, right? Beyond that kind of thing where it really gets a lot of attention. Like you know, like all of the liberal big accounts will weigh in on it and be like, you should leave the Catholic Church and you should you know, like George Takei's account had a thing that was like, Buddhists don't tell you can't commune with the universe if you disagree about abortion or something like that kind of thing, or, you know, like whatever, you know, stuff like that. Like just, and the level of debate is very, very low and kind of dumb, but it's also very functional for both sides kind of thing.
yeah.
Like where, you know, both sides are like, get to rile up their troops and rattle around some donations and stuff like that, you know, like just NGOs versus NGOs kind of stuff. And I don't know. So it's very irritating, but it does bring in that kind of, you know, the reason why it's also got that debate kind of salience is because it's got this very, very complex, at least like ideologically complex, like, okay, you know, can a church make that kind of claim on a leader, you know, about their individual political opinions and practices, whatever, in a way that, you know, it within the ideology of the religion, you know, like is pretty profound. It's like, you know, you are basically to some extent being excluded from the religion, being kicked out to some extent, you know, like you're being denied a very basic sacrament in the religion because of this disagreement, which they, you know, within the architecture of the belief is like, you know, this guy is participating in basically some sort of insane genocide of millions of babies or something like that kind of thing, you know, like, and then but the rage that it generates is very, very interesting. And I think it's because of that, it's that idea of that collective making a claim on someone's, you know, it's like, okay, you don't want to do that, then we don't do this kind of thing or whatever, you know, like it's like this back and forth. And it creates like this rage because it's like a collective claim that doesn't fit perfectly into the liberal kind of model or whatever, right? Like it's like it's saying we have this power over you to not, you know, over your life, that doesn't filter down into the very easy, you know, liberal assumptions about what a life should be. It's like, you know, it taps into very, very deep old American prejudices about like how Catholics are trying to take over the government and stuff like that. Like,
Sure.
And I kind of, I get that. Like, I think I get that that's why it's like a salient debate point where people are going to go back and forth about it and stuff. But it's also at such a low, weird level and such a, it feels like the kind of fight that people have under, like, say, Obama or Clinton or something, you know, like it's like we pivot to these kinds of debates. We pivot to these kinds of, you know, how many angels dance on a pinhead kind of debates where it's like we don't know where we're going to go with it, kind of thing, you know, where would this kind of debate, like, how is it productive in any way for anyone other than just kind of this cheap back and forth or something? So, I don't know. I understand that involves like conflicting types of ideology and stuff like that I just don't have as much of an investment in. Like, I don't have the same opinions about pro-life stuff that other people do, and I don't, you know, but I don't know. It's just it's a very bizarre, punishing to read kind of debate, because you see these people making very, very flippant points back and forth, and it feels like a pseudo politics or something like that. So, you know.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is that we don't really have like a really good alternative. Like, I think this is a good example of it where, okay, so let's try to examine this issue from a different kind of perspective, where it's not like, does the church have a right to kind of like I don't know, like supersede someone's personal opinions that we kind of view as like a sacrosanct kind of thing, or as like a sacred thing, that someone has a right to like have their personal opinions, and then you know, that's like a liberal kind of, that's like one of the bases of like engagement with like a liberal political community, right? Is that you like, you have your personal opinions and you offer that up, and then it's in the marketplace of ideas and all that kind of stuff. So as a Catholic, you have some sort of you know, the church has, or I would imagine, has some sway over your opinions, right? Like, they have some authority that you accept as like, well, they know better than me on certain things, you know, and that should have some sway over it. So it's sort of like, well, we should allow the Catholic community to kind of determine this for themselves, but then the issue is like that community is also governed by this ideology. Like, the way people in the community think about things is just, they're not totally separate, right? Like, they're just Americans and whatever, like the same as anybody else. So like, what's the alternative, right? Like, you could talk about, you know, you were discussing like in a socialist context where you want to look at like, is this a thing that we want to put energy into, like, in our, to produce in our economy and all that kind of stuff. But it's difficult to come up with a metric that would be like, well, this is better than that because of XYZ, because you can kind of easily argue one way or the other. So I think like it's very difficult to arrive at a place where you can like rationally determine one decision over the other, because like any kind of like decision making along those lines ends up kind of, I don't know, you can end up arguing both sides pretty easily. I think because these questions aren't really, we're trying to answer them in ways where you can't really do that, so we end up with these kind of like indefinable, intangible terms that are being used as if they were rational, tangible, measurable things, and you end up being able to do it both ways. You know, like with the abortion thing, you can kind of find a way to argue that on both sides. With even with like the drug war and stuff, you can find a way to argue that on both sides. Although, like, you make a very good point that the way that the drug war is prosecuted and the way that we kind of administrate the prohibition of drugs and stuff is clearly the big problem, more so than any kind of philosophical debate about like what should and shouldn't be allowed. So I don't know. I think it's very difficult, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it becomes difficult even in the context of things like ecology and, you know, environmentalism, where,
yeah,
I mean, to some extent, it's not the case that you just want this free-for-all of production where, you know, everyone gets to choose what they want to maximize to produce through, you know, consumerism and stuff. To some extent, you want almost like a base zero kind of thing, where it's like, unless you have some sort of good reason for it, you know, to induce some sort of production, you don't necessarily want, you don't want to induce production that you don't need, kind of thing. You know, you don't want like
sure,
just a bunch of junk floating around, and it's almost like, you know, if those trade-offs exist too. I mean, the obvious trade-off that people, I think you kind of, you know, come across at some point in your life at least, like, is this idea that like, okay, even in my own life, I have to trade off what my own needs are with other people not just maybe within a family, but within, like a society at large kind of thing where, both of us live relatively comfortable lives in, rich countries and stuff. And, but, at some level, it's like, okay, well, if I didn't buy that next video game that for $50, whatever, I could donate that and it would like maybe feed another person for a few days or something like that kind of, like there's that kind of trade-off too, where within our current system, at least at some theoretical level, those trade-offs exist, and we kind of suppress them within our own minds because you can't live like that. You can't live thinking that way, really, to any extreme extent or something. And,
or at least the everyday person, like to
sure.
expect like the population at large to think that way is just not going to happen.
But those kind of things, that ecological basis then also becomes a way of thinking of other like social institutions that you're worried about and stuff, where like say for religion or something, like what is the optimal number of churches that you should be building as a society every year or something like that, that kind of thing, like or should we, if like the situation, the population changes within the way that religions set up, like should you take a church from one community and give it to a mosque or something like that kind of, what I mean, like those kind of, within an actual everyday society, you don't notice those things and you don't consider those decisions because of how they're filtered through money and different types of policy and stuff. But it really does exist as like a problem of like, like what kind of production do we maximize even within the cultural / religious kind of sphere or something like that. So, most people would maybe say, I mean, not most people, like, most secular people would probably say, we should put very small amount of money into this kind of stuff or whatever, or small amount of resources into, like how much Sunday school should we have or something. But like, I don't know, we're going to have to think of ways how to negotiate that involve some sort of individual reckoning with things, even if money doesn't exist in the same way or something like that kind of thing. So,
Yeah. And I keep thinking it always comes back to this for me. Like, how do you even, let's say that you get away from the problem in whatever kind of way of, oh, well, we're just letting people do whatever they want for their own sort of personal gain and their personal interests. And that just like leads to this kind of like chaotic, anarchic thing that's like unmanaged. And so we're not even able to make those decisions collectively. Well, let's say we somehow resolve that. It still comes down to like, well, by what metric do we make these decisions? It's not as easy as just like, oh, well, we just need to get everyone, on the same page and then we're good to go. It's still a very difficult thing to evaluate. Like, how do you determine this exactly? I think we've sort of taken a shortcut with this like libertarian sort of thinking about like, well, if it doesn't bother anyone, then you shouldn't stop them from doing it. We can see problems with that, and just like on a logical level. And I think there's plenty of examples of like where that also fails, like at in the consequences of that kind of policy and that kind of like cultural consensus and everything. But I don't know what you can really, how do you resolve that? It's not really very clear to me. I think that when you look at like a pre-modern and especially like a religious context, I don't think we can like just go back to those sorts of systems and stuff. I think we need to kind of figure things out on our own in our own sort of way. But I do think like that they were a little bit more honest about the fact that like certain things are to some extent arbitrary. Like they didn't have the same kind of sense of we were talking about like how we kind of think of this as like sort of being rationally, like some almost like scientifically sort of determined thing of like, well, we've transcended irrational thinking about these sorts of issues, and now we determine them on some kind of rational basis, and that can be socialist or like a liberal capitalist sort of thing. It both suffers from the same problem, right? Of like imagining yourself as like objective when you're not really being objective. You're just kind of pretending that this easy way of framing an issue makes it rationalized, makes it kind of like outside of prejudice and bias and stuff like that, and then you kind of just go with that, and like how whoever kind of argues it in those terms wins the debate, and then the issue is solved. Well, what you're really just doing is entrenching some kind of you're going back to this thing that you're hoping to get away from. I don't even think that getting away from that kind of like quote unquote irrational cultural stuff, like that sort of decision making, I don't know if that's possible, and I don't know if that's even like a problem. I think that's just a human thing that we do, and that's just kind of how it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it does like because we don't have a kind of like an underlying basis for anything except that, it's very difficult to figure out, well, what's a good alternative to this, or what's like a way of resolving this problem, because it's just like, well, that's all we have, so we have to come up with something new, or I really don't know.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this stuff really does like historically come down to like sort of a Marxist thing where these values around letting this idea of decentralization of decision making a lot of the time comes down to allowing owners of property to make decisions over their own workers and over their own lives. And then that sort of maybe trickles down through struggle and stuff to different ways where average people have used that language to, leverage the situation to be able to eke out kind of maybe some freedoms other than that kind of thing, like other than just basic commercial kind of property related freedoms. And, that's always, that whole process has always been, off and on in different ways. Like there's it like what we attribute consistency to in this sort of capitalist project is not always true. I mean, like it was compatible with slavery for a long period of time. It was compatible with, I mean, even stuff like the drug war and stuff like, I think that's why for libertarian, politically minded people in the United States, that's why that there's like a lot of rage around it, is because, it seems straightforwardly in contradiction with these commercial values of allowing people to trade things that they want, even if they cause harm and stuff. And because, I mean, that's what a lot of the rest of the American economy is like, it's production of like guns, or it's production of, like all of these other types of things that, it's unhealthy foods. It's, it's just, I don't know. Like, I really do think that, like, I mean, the Trump era kind of proved it, is that like, you've got this almost like Rage Against the Machine cinematic universe society or something like that kind of thing where, and, I mean, I think that, there is this sort of like, well, why not this other thing too then kind of thing. So
which is like fair enough, but there's clearly an issue with that, right? Like,
sure,
we start, everyone is, when they start thinking of, I shouldn't say everyone, but most people, when they start to kind of like say like, well, I think libertarianism appeals to everybody on some level, they kind of think about that because we have these like inherited ideas about like leaving each other alone and like liberty and freedom and all this kind of stuff. It appeals on some level, but as soon as you start to kind of walk down that road a little bit, you're like, wait a second, you want to have private police? Wait, you want private owned sidewalks? Like, at some point there's some kind of stopping block where you're like, oh, that's why this doesn't work. That's why we sort of can't just embrace this logic fully. I think most people end up in that place at some point. But you take that logic and you walk it back. It never made sense at any point, really. Like, it doesn't work on any kind of level fundamentally. It's not like it's some kind of evil thing because it doesn't work, but it's just not a rational argument for anything, really. I would say that it's, from my view, it's rational in that it doesn't produce harm, generally speaking, compared to alternatives that we have when it works, right? But many times it doesn't work, and we just don't have a good way of determining when is this working, when is this not working, Instead, we just have like, are we applying these dogmatic principles? If yes, then it's working fine,
Yeah, that kind of reminded me of this sort of tying it together in a way is that like that, some of my friends who are socialists and Catholics are looking at the Biden kind of thing, and a lot of the sort of mainstream liberal debate around the Biden communion issue, they're saying, well, it's not like the bishops would deny, they didn't deny this or that person communion, like this politician communion, even though they supported a war. They didn't deny this person,
Yeah.
like they kind of go down the list of other bad things in society that are pretty bad, or like support for torturers and stuff. And then, so the socialist Catholic response that I've seen from some people is, well, then, yeah, maybe we should do that or something like that kind of thing. And
Right.
it's a flippant kind of argument, but it is kind of one of those things. It's like, okay, well, if we do have leverage, and or I mean, I think of it in terms of leverage. You can also kind of say, well, there is a basic matter of respect and integrity of the community and stuff too, right? Where it's like, if you don't have some sort of line of who can participate, then there is no church kind of thing, right? Like it's just like it becomes almost like a civil society, civil function or something, where you're just distributing the Eucharist to everyone, and there's no actual belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and stuff. So, but I mean, this also comes around in different ways where, the churches were denying the Eucharist to like gay people and stuff like that, right? Like I don't know if it still doesn't. I mean, maybe in some places, but there was this very long tradition of, if someone was like openly gay, you shouldn't give them communion because
They were like, you should be on the other side of this. We need to get you in the priest robe. Like, you got this all twisted.
Yeah. So I don't know, but it's one of those things where it gets very, very tangled in stuff, and I don't know. To be honest, it makes me doubt like more and more, like that just the capacity of the church to navigate those kind of problems and stuff in the United States, especially, where it's just like, you've got this whole, I don't know, it's like it's very, very determined to be a culture war institution right now in a lot of ways, and that's not true at all localities, and it's not true like, it's not 100% true in different ways, because there is all that, so like a social justice element to it, but like, I don't know, like it's really not like pleasant to just see that focus or something like that. So I think that's the, I understand when people are kind of saying there's this balance where you're like, okay, well, you maybe should be excluding other people and stuff, but I don't know. It gets into this. It feels like one of those like traps where like the further you get into it, it's a quicksand or something like that. Like the further you get into it, the more you struggle with it, the more you get into it, the more you're getting away from the whole point of trying to escape it, kind of thing or something. So
Right. Like you would like to say that, well, the socialist, this contingent of Catholic socialists seems to be more consistent in that, like, they're saying, if we're going to do this, let's apply it, to all these different leaders and stuff. But then you get back to things that they may really have a problem with, like with gay people or something. Well, maybe that's like, how can we like really take those two things apart? Like if the church has a certain stance on an issue and values it as something that would qualify you for not receiving the communion or whatever, then you can't really like pick and choose. You really have to go like all in or nothing on it. But maybe it runs into the same kind of problem as this idea of like the libertarian market kind of stuff, where it's like, maybe this thinking about things in these terms in the first place, it isn't really very reasonable in the first place. Like, it's one thing for the church to have its like position on something and to whatever, but like if that ends up being something that's like a significant social factor in some way, then it needs to be tied, I guess, in some kind of measure to like, is this a social good or not? I think it's funny. It's funny that it took me this long to realize like what you're describing is exactly the same thing that goes on with like takfir and all that kind of stuff in the Muslim community, where like certain leaders are like, there's especially like kind of like fundamentalist, sort of like Saudi inflected types of Muslims make takfir on all kinds of different leaders because they're not doing this or they are doing that or whatever. And there's like a debate about like, to what extent do you have a duty to do this, and to what extent do you have like can you not do that, so long as there's like certain, like a bare minimum of what the leader is doing before you can actually make takfir of them and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's pretty, it's very similar, I think, in my eyes, in that like it tends to be a very obvious split along like political lines that are determined by other kinds of logic. It's not really based on this one question. People kind of pick and choose how they apply it. And then but I mean, I do see like now it's a little bit more resolved in that the various camps on the issue have their camps, and they've kind of come to peace with like, this is just a debate. Some people have this opinion, some people have this opinion, but there's like a consensus on like, probably not a good idea to just be takfiring people willy-nilly for the most part. So yeah, and I think there's like reasonable voices that are have kind of like clarified the issue enough that it's like not as big a thing as it used to be. So hopefully that kind of happens with the Catholic thing too.
Yeah, I mean the most sort of reasonable explanation I've seen from someone was basically saying, okay, well, if you have, I think of it in terms of like the ideological architecture or something. So you've got this one point, which is the Eucharist is the real presence of Christ, and therefore is incredibly like sacred and holy and has to be distributed only. You shouldn't take it lightly if you're just giving it to someone that in your heart is participating in this other process that you consider. I always use the word genocidal because that's basically the way that the logic goes. I think if you think that millions of people are being killed for a particular reason, then the argument is those are two pretty basic. Those individual beliefs are pretty basic to the Catholic religion in the United States. Like, of people who are like committed Catholics in different ways that are part of the architecture of like the church or whatever, like the hierarchy and all that. Both of those beliefs are pretty solid most of the time, kind of thing, or whatever. And then it's almost like if you just focus on those two things, you're compelled to do it, so that anyone that disagrees with that has to disagree with either of those points. They have to believe that there is no real presence of Christ, and it's just a memorial that kind of symbolizes Christ or something like that kind of thing. That is not, the stakes are low on that. Or they have to think that abortion is not really that big of a deal, that it has to be stopped as if it's like some war crime or something like that kind of thing. And me personally, I don't know where, like when I hear it laid out like that, I just go, yeah, well, I don't know if I do believe in either of those ones in that put it that way kind of thing, like I think that it becomes kind of almost like a flippant thing. It's like, well, if you don't believe that, then you're sort of outside of this thing. And it's like, well, yeah, but I don't know, I look at it and I go, I almost reverse the onus to some extent, where it's like, if you believe both those things, you wouldn't be so flippant about it,
Yeah.
It wouldn't be exactly a culture war thing.
Right.
So, but then I think to myself, if that's true, then I'm also saying that they don't believe one of those things, Like I'm
Right.
saying that you don't, I'm saying if you're saying that, then you don't really think this is a genocide. If you're joking about it and to some extent, or trying to score points in an argument or something like that, kind of, I just don't think that. And at the same time, because as I said, you don't deny it, you don't rigorously deny it to all sorts of people and stuff like that based on the same criteria. You also don't believe, to some extent, maybe, that in this sort of real presence thing that you're saying that you do to that extent, kind of thing, or something like that. I don't know. I feel like, or at the very least, there's got to be some. You're not at 100% on both of them for sure, or something like that. So that filters down into politics. And so, yeah, anyways.
Yeah, you know what that reminds me of? I think I've mentioned this hadith before, maybe you remember it, but it's about takfir, and it said the Prophet said that if a brother makes takfir of his brother, then one of them is right. In other words, if you're declaring someone outside of the religion, well, one of you is outside of it. So like it's
exactly.
basically like it's a grievous thing to make that claim in the first place, but if you're at the point of making that claim and you're like a righteous person, you're like speaking the truth about it, then it's true. But if it's not, then you are really stepping outside of the bounds to the point that you're essentially takfiring yourself by taking it too lightly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there is a danger always in focusing on the kind of flippant back and forths that happen online and stuff like that, or like there's also like a tendency maybe to identify a particular aspect of a debate with the whole institution too, kind of thing, where I mean, like, this is one thing that they're focused on, that they're doing and stuff, but you got to think that like the average Catholic Church, a lot of what they're doing is just like really, really boring, not boring, but like mundane kind of, or not, maybe not mundane either, but like, this stuff like, they're holding weddings, they're doing funerals,
they have other
soup
other
kitchens
things
and stuff, like
yeah.
They might, this is what bishops get up to when they meet, but like it's not necessarily the way that the average person experiences the religion even. So yeah,
it's difficult, man. Like I was saying, I don't know how to get around some of these questions. The point, I don't know if I made it clear before, the point I was trying to get at with like a religious sort of view of this, or maybe a pre-modern view that's heavily grounded in like a religious tradition. I think it's a little bit more honest about certain things, in that like the arbitrariness of certain aspects that are just accepted are kind of like baked in as not exactly arbitrary, but there's not like we believe this is true because of XYZ, like rational reasoning, kind of there's not like a formula that's on display to be like, well, here's the formula, this is why we know all this is. There's a certain level of, this is what God wants, and we know what God wants for XYZ reasons, and that's kind of, you can debate around that and stuff, but at a certain level it kind of hits a floor where it's like, well, because of God, and that's it.
Sure.
And I mean, even in like a context where it's not exactly like in an Abrahamic sort of like God-based sort of thing, there's like a sense of like, well, this is like the natural order of things, this is the natural way of things, like that the king is determined by whatever kind of law or whatever. I don't know if it's like I said before, I don't know if there's a way to get around this like basic arbitrary nature of like collective decision making at some level. I think it sort of has to maybe go that way, possibly. Like that just seems like, I haven't seen like real proof otherwise. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but like I just kind of feels that way.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at the historical problem with this, like the broader problem of, we're still assuming in most of what we're talking about of this, of a variety of different religions debating with each other, people being able to enter and exit the religions if they feel like it, as if they were associations and all that kind of stuff, where, for a lot of history and that concept was very alien to how people actually ran things. Like societies would be one religion or the other and stuff like that kind of thing, and the state would somehow be fused with that to some extent, or at least like it informed a lot of what was going on in society to the degree that it wasn't this sort of like marketplace of ideas kind of idea of religion kind of thing.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
it was like,
I would frame it as like the legitimacy of a political body would be based in large part on some kind of religious character.
Yeah. And I think that like that difference gets back to the same kind of idea of what kind of truth does a society reflect and adhere to, which is it's stuff like, should a constitution of a country say we're a Christian nation or something like that kind of thing,
Right.
or should it say we're an Islamic republic? Like, obviously, this kind of stuff came up. I mean, it comes up all the time, but it especially came up on things like, say, after the United States invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff, where they, had that constitution building process and stuff, whatever, where, and
Right.
in both of those countries, they came to the conclusion that they would, at least on paper, say, I'm pretty sure that it's still the case in both of those countries where it says something like, we are Islamic republics. Like, that's
Yeah,
like,
I think that's
yeah.
true. There was this book this guy Feldman wrote about, like, he was working for a committee involved with Iraq and was like involved with the constitution writing in Iraq, and he wrote a book like arguing in favor of involving Sharia on some level in the development of like states in the Middle East and stuff. I mean, complete neocon kind of guy, right? But like,
Yeah.
at the same time, he wasn't he wasn't like this kind of like wild like Islamophobe kind of a thing. Like it's a fairly scholarly, like, kind of intelligent take on, I mean, the colonial project of nation building. So like, like putting that aside, like your moral judgments about that aside, he did argue like in favor of that, and I think that's essentially the track that people went down with that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, related to that, in Christian countries, a lot of countries, maybe in, say, Latin America or in Europe, they might have some constitutional or legal recognition where either there's like a treaty with the Vatican, or there's some sort of relationship with the church that's not, it doesn't fit neatly into liberal sort of values in different ways, or it's been reworked to fit liberal ideology, but not necessarily actually not in this kind of like, rights come from rational whatever stuff. So like, you'll have constitutional clauses that say stuff like, the religion of the people in this nation is predominantly Christian or something like that. So it's like a nod to it, but it's not, there's no actual function to it most of the time,
Yeah,
like
like with monarchies in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of those got grandfathered in because they sort of like accepted the terms of what like the next stage of society was going to look like or whatever.
Sure.
And it's just it's interesting because you would sort of assume like, well, monarchy is like fundamentally opposed to the basic principles of governance that we accept today by and large, right? But
Yeah.
um, that's obviously on display with like the Middle Eastern, like Saudi Arabia and the
Mm-hmm.
Gulf monarchies and stuff. But that those still exist in Europe too, and we don't seem to kind of view them as the same thing. So
Yeah, I mean, because they don't feel like there's the same effective power of those institutions in Europe or something like that. But I don't know. I think that like, I think that's true. But I mean, from like sort of like an ideological perspective, that's true too. That like, I made this point before, but I think it's funny that like in Canada, if you think about it theoretically, there's like, I mean, there's all the different standard liberal justifications for things that are sort of independent of the actual documents. But if you look at like the actual documents and sort of read into them a bit, like what the traditions are and stuff, like theoretically, like there was like tribes in, Anglo-Saxon, whatever, in like people in the UK, whatever, or like whatever it was called, like ancient whatever, right? And those people over time fought for sort of rights and stuff, and then they, the monarch was appointed by God or whatever to help them manage their ancient rights, whatever, as Englishmen or whatever. And then over time, it's like this dissension of like, and then it developed this legal system, and then Canada adopted it from, this colonial process or something. But like at some level, it's supposed to be that like the government is allowed to tax you because these ancient tribes decided, whatever, like,
Yeah.
thousand years ago, whatever. Like it just seems very, very kind of silly. And that's why I think like a lot of the time people make fun of like sovereign citizens a lot, and that I think that's true. Like the people that are like, there's a fringe on the flag, so these
Yeah,
laws
yeah.
don't
Am I
apply to
being
me.
detained? All those type of
Yeah, yeah.
folks.
But that's what like a lot of the actual legal system reads like when you read more about it and stuff. Like it's like all these, especially in most of the world. Like in the United States, it's much more written in this very specific kind of tone where it's like, just almost chemically pure liberalism or something like that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Where it's like, but like in most of the world, it's like this bizarre, like conflicting historical kind of thing. Like, and I don't know. I find that very interesting. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe the Mongols were onto something. I kind of think of this type of stuff like as like a national mythology, like even just national history in general. Like we all kind of have like these history classes where we learn about the history of the country. The It's not so much that like I'm saying that those are mythological in that they didn't happen on some level the way that they're narrated, but it's more that there's like a certain shared narrative that's generated by this so that we can all kind of accept like the legitimacy of the state because like we all know the story and it makes sense on some level that we're willing to
Mm-hmm.
accept because like the end result is that we have like a decent enough life, like so that it's there's no reason to kind of like fight it.
Mm-hmm.
uh, so like if that's the national mythology, you can look back at like these different mythologies that have existed in different states to justify them, and they're essentially performing a similar function. The Mongols, like like the Mongol Empire Mongols, they had a kind of a same kind of a thing, but it was a secret history, which what that means is that like only basically the ruling family was able to actually read it. It was kept secret. It was kept in Karakorum in Mongolia. So like people they didn't have access to it.
Mm-hmm.
It was like there was this big ritual around like the reading of it. They would have like scholars and just like the ruling family attending it and all that kind of stuff. Maybe they were onto something with that.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
Keeping it away from people. So it's like, well, we're in charge because we're gonna kill you if if you fight back. But
Yeah.
we do have a history. There is a reason we're in charge, but we're not. We're not supposed to tell you, and that's just you're gonna have to accept those terms.
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
don't
funny.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have anything wrapping up thoughts or anything, or do you want to get into questions or?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've been a little bit all over the place and kind of inconclusive, which maybe is a little frustrating. But I just think this is like a really difficult question, and I feel like I don't know. You clarified my thinking on it a little bit in that I think it is really about political legitimacy,
Mm-hmm.
and that is it never really needs to make sense. It just has to be good enough to like sustain a, a state and like civilization basically. Like if you think like in terms of like caveman type situation where it's like very small community like hunter gatherer type situation, if you want to get beyond like just surviving day to day, you have to work with other people. If you're going to work, as that scales up, working with other people involves working with people you don't really know or trust or even like very much. And to make that work on like a pretty on any kind of like size, you have to have some sort of like cohesive narrative like this kind of mythological thing that kind of binds people together so they can accept each other as part of a community, and that there's a reason that you're doing things the way you're doing things, and it is for like a shared benefit, even if you wouldn't arrive at that decision.
Sure.
Like if it was up to you personally on it, like, and it also wouldn't make sense to have like every single person make that decision, right?
Sure.
So I guess it sort of like boils down to that, like but then on the flip side, when that becomes when you start debating about these kind of things, I don't know. I don't know if that's even a problem. Maybe that's just how it plays out naturally. Like it's always going to be on that basis. Cause like, you have like kings fighting over like dynastic rights based on this kind of stuff. And, it's sort of how history is played out. So Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm back on the inconclusive side again. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Definitely illuminated things for me. So hopefully for the listeners as well.
Sure.
All right, guys. Let's get into the questions here. Let's start with this one. Is it true that Catholic academics are only searching for validation of what they consider objective truth, that Jesus Christ died and rose again, in contrast to secular academics who try to hold no prior assumptions in their search for objective truth, discounting those academics who are relativists?
I guess, yeah, this is just, I guess the question is just like, are Catholic academics biased, I guess? Is that part of it, or is it like...
Yeah, I'm sort of interpreting it that way. I don't know if it's, I don't think it's trying to be like a gotcha question. I think it's saying like...
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You know, are secular academics just as biased as we might think?
Oh, okay.
You know, someone with religious affiliations might be.
Yeah, I guess... yeah, I guess for any sort of academic, you're interested in certain types of problems, mm-hmm. and you want to be able to hash through them. I don't think it's really the case that most people that, you know, get into academia, like stick with their original opinions the whole time. I don't know, like you know, Catholic or anything. I think that like people do evolve, a lot of them, but I don't know. I think that like, yeah, I guess it just depends on what kind of problems you're interested in solving. If you're interested in proving, like, is this about like theology? Do you mean, like, is it like, do you think, or like, is it about like?
I was thinking history. For some reason, I read the word history into it, but it's actually not here. But I was thinking of like Catholic historians, versus like secular historians, for example.
I mean, that's obviously true to some extent, where you've got like fields like medieval studies, where I've heard that, like, you know, almost half of them, the academics or something like that, will be faithful Catholics or something like that kind of thing, and because they get into it because of that reason or something like that. Like, I mean, that's maybe for a very narrow range of it too, like maybe just certain types of European history, sure, or something like that. But like, I don't know. I think that like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure where the question's going. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking about this in. I don't think that serious academics are like especially biased in terms of the questions they're responding to or the problems that they're interrogating. I mean, if someone's a serious person and they're doing like they're applying like a rigorous study to something, like they may have a personal bias, but I think that comes into play whether they have a particular religious affiliation or whether they don't. Like, I know in like Islamic studies, you know, like a majority of those people are essentially out to disprove like Orthodox Islamic claims.
Oh, really?
Like a lot of, yeah, I mean, not all of them. Most of them are pretty good, and it's getting better as time goes on. But, you know, it's sort of like inherited from like Orientalism and stuff. And so there's just been a lot of really wacky out there kind of theories that have, you know, at certain points been held as like the consensus scholarly view, which nowadays just look like obvious, like kind of, you know, Islamophobic propaganda kind of stuff. Like, so, you know, I maybe I'm like too biased the other way, but I think there are plenty of secular academics who bring their own prejudices to bear on the questions they're looking at, just as much as it would be true of a religious person. But by and large, I'm willing to trust like someone who's like a serious person, regardless. Like I think there are Catholic historians, for example. History is just the one I keep thinking about. Okay. I guess it's the one I know most about. But, you know, there are serious Catholic historians who are looking at things and like treating it with like due diligence, and it has nothing to do with the fact that they have like a certain theology or whatever. Like they're willing to look at like biblical history or whatever, and it's not just like a kind of desperate defense of orthodoxy or something. Like they accept there are certain historical like problems that are interesting, and they kind of weigh both sides of it, you know, just the same as like a secular thinking person would, you know. I think when it comes to this kind of stuff, like the methodology is usually, if it's good, like if it's a good study, the methodology will be very clear to whoever, to whatever if you're reading it to the reader, it'll be clear to you, and then you'll be able to see that they've either followed through with that methodology or not and arrived at certain conclusions. Like it's not too hard to tell who's, got other interests at play,
Yeah, I think about among like professional critical historians and stuff like that I would consider good historians. There's almost like an obsession around biases and stuff like that, like trying to figure out what kind of lenses you bring to criticism, what kind of like, and then almost like an obsession with trying to find balance in the arguments and stuff like that too,
Mm-hmm.
like trying to get the right, and giving space to other people that have said other things and stuff too, just to make sure that you've got your bases covered and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
I do think it's true that there are probably a good number of people who basically start from what the church says and then work backwards.
Right. Either positive or negative.
Yeah, sure.
Sometimes it's to like, oh, this is what the church says, it must be wrong, and that's just as bad as going the other way.
Yeah, but we're not. I don't think we're in a situation right now where at least in Canada, the United States, where any particular viewpoint is so powerful that you can't challenge it to some extent, kind of thing. By at least if you're just maybe for like career reasons or something like that, there's certain things, but like I feel like like it's not, I don't know, if anything I think that, like as you said, like to some extent, like it's sort of like wacky theories get precedence in the culture to some extent, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like where like I don't know, I always joke about this with like documentaries and stuff, where there's like documentaries that are like, did Jesus exist and stuff and all that kind of stuff, or like I don't know, like, was the Bible a forgery or something? And you're like, what do you mean? And then it's like,
right,
and I don't know. So
yeah, to me it almost seems like in vogue to sort of adopt the opposite, almost like as like a surprise kind of move, like,
sure,
oh, I'm a secular person, but actually the orthodoxy has a lot of merit to it based on this objective study, or I'm a religious person, but like, let's examine these, let's scrutinize our tradition, and that seems more in vogue than just like,
sure.
These are my personal beliefs, I'm going to defend them, like, wholeheartedly or whatever. Like it seems more like there's an interest in kind of like finding some, just being interested in what the other side has to offer, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I find that a lot with like sort of like online celebrity theologians and stuff, where they seem to be very to lean into stuff like, yeah, I'm a Christian and I believe in all of it, but I also think that like taking heroin every day is a great idea, or something like that. Kind of, you're like, what? And it's like, yeah, I don't know. So
yeah. All right, let's see what else we got here. Would you rather live in PRC or Formosa?
Yeah, so for listeners, Formosa is the name of Taiwan that I think the Japanese used. I don't know if it was also before that, but like...
yeah, well, I was going to ask you, what's the political valence or connotation of that term? Because I knew it referred to Taiwan, but I was like, who says that? Like, what does it mean if you use that word?
Yeah, I think it's negative. I think that like nowadays they're not... Yeah.
I don't want to end up doing the Mandarin apology like John Cena.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it would depend on what I was doing, kind of thing. Like, I would love to move to China, like to PRC, like to the mainland, for a while. I think that would be a lot of fun if I was like, say, living in, like Shanghai or Beijing or maybe some other city, and not really involved in politics or anything like that, kind of thing. Like, don't care about that kind of side of things as much, but more just kind of, just living, like maybe doing some sort of writing or something like that for foreign stuff or whatever. Maybe like that had no relationship to China even, like I just happened to live in China. And then like, going out to restaurants and hanging out and visiting other places and stuff. That kind of thing would be fun, I think, and good. But I think that if there was some political thing involved, or if I wanted to live somewhere for the rest of my life or something like that kind of thing, I was forced to choose between those two places, I would probably pick Taiwan, just because it seems like nowadays, at least, I would have a bit more latitude in deciding what kind of things I would write about and all that kind of stuff, like be able to be critical, be able to participate more in society in different ways. So I'd probably feel more thing. I mean, imagining to some extent that, like, because of the magic of the question, you can't get mad at me for getting involved in the politics or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't want to just live in the PRC and not be able to, for 30 years or something, and not be able to just militate about socialism or something like that kind of thing. So
When I first was reading this question, for some reason I assumed that I wouldn't be allowed to leave. So my initial impression was, well, mainland China, because there's more of it, so I would have more ability to travel around and see different parts of the country and stuff, versus a smaller island nation. And then I realized, wait, I could still leave. It's not like I'm imprisoned in one of these countries. So it kind of throws me off there. And then I'm sort of torn in terms of okay, well, what's the Muslim angle on this? And so in China, I could join the ETIM and help establish a caliphate in Western China.
Yeah. Sure.
But on the Taiwan side, they were a lot of the generals that were kind of supporting the whole the independence thing and all that, they were Muslim. So I'm kind of torn. Do I adopt that that part of the history as my own and kind of follow in their footsteps, sort of a thing, or do I help out the Uyghurs in the West? I don't know.
Sure. Okay. I guess for listeners, I haven't really said this, but a few weeks ago or whatever, I got offered to write an article for a Taiwanese publication.
Oh wow.
And it was I think it's an online local kind of thing or something, and they couldn't pay me a lot because Taiwan, it's still a lot of any media project is not doesn't have a lot of money for freelancers, but it was I was I agreed to do it because it was they had already had the idea, and I thought it would be cool to have written for a Taiwanese publication or something. I just thought that would be neat. And he ended up double checking the idea with his superiors, and they said, absolutely not. That is not a good idea. And
Wow.
stuff. So, no problem there. I mean, it's just it's just one of those things where editors have to constantly go through that process of, working through pitches and stuff and seeing if things work or not. But I just felt very lucky to be asked for something like that. I just found it neat. I started imagining writing more for other international outlets and stuff. That'd be fun. And so I don't know, but I thought that was a neat, to be able to have written about Taiwanese politics or something like that. That would have been fun. So
Yeah, that's cool. I've been wanting to do an episode about Taiwan and the the history of it as a settler nation and stuff, because I think a lot of people are unaware of that history, that that it was a bunch of people from China who took over this island with an army that was essentially built by the CIA off the back of opium money and stuff, and then just wiped out the native population. It's like a colonial state. Which I think kind of we don't think of it that way, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Although,
I don't know much about it really, other than that. I don't know. I only know a little bit because of the Nationalist Party and stuff like that, but I don't know a huge amount. So that'd be good for me too. So yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm gonna have to make a Cantonese apology video if we do that episode. But yeah. Let's see. Given that Professor Pizzagate has predicted all the fascist Western dogs will die from their vaccinations, what are Don's thoughts on how the vaccines will forward a Maoist revolution?
I don't know. I feel like with Professor Pizzagate, with Mike, like we a lot of it is interesting to me because, I think that the way that he looks at it a lot of the time is that there's like, maybe like a few dozen potential problems that are identified here and there with all these different things. And it like, it just drives him crazy that the way that debate is framed is that like pointing those things out individually or collectively or whatever is very, very frowned upon in the media discourse until one of them is proven true or something like that kind of thing. Like, and at that point, tends to be quickly forgotten that there was any sort of jeering or making fun of it or something like that kind of thing at that point. Mm-hmm. Now, I can get that that's irritating to some people if they're like, well, basically, I don't want to hear the negative stuff. I just want to wait until the problems crop up and stuff. But I mean, there's lots of things like I was reading the other day that like there was a concert in New York or like some sort of Bruce Springsteen musical or something like that kind of thing, and they said that only vaccines that were approved by the American government are going to be accepted for like access to the venue, whatever, right? Well, that excludes a lot of different vaccines from around the world that are not approved by the U.S. government, but are still, like most people in the United Kingdom got. I think it's probably a majority of the people that have gotten shots are AstraZeneca, Oxford, like the, and which is like not one of the mRNA ones, whatever, mRNA ones, so. And in Canada, U.S. gave a lot of those vaccines to Canada because basically, and a lot of around the world and stuff, they were giving these, basically treating them like garbage to give to other people or something like that kind of thing. And because those vaccines are not approved in the United States, you're not allowed to do that you're not allowed to go to that venue, whatever, maybe in the United States kind of thing or something like that, if you're from Canada or something, but those are the kind of like things that, those navigating those kind of things are like, if you had said that kind of thing like 6 months ago or something like that, or whatever, if you said, well, they're going to start making it so people that even if they get a vaccine are going to be excluded from certain types of activities because they don't get the right vaccine, even though we're being told that all vaccines are safe, and now we know they're not, or something, like stuff like that. Like, you would sound irritating, I think, to a lot of people, but even though it ended up being 100% true or something like that kind of thing. So, yeah.
There's a lot of like, you don't accept something because it sounds too much like something your political opponents would say.
Yeah.
And
so, anyways, I mean, I appreciate that from him, is that he's willing to hash through a lot of stuff and not, I mean, he tends to maybe come down on the more critical side of things all the time. But like, I don't know, that's probably, I find that more interesting than just, trying to say the thing that's smart and accepted by sort of like the liberal mainstream or something like that all the time. So
yeah, I think he also tends to focus a little bit more from like a insider perspective kind of thing on like how like flimsy and just shallow a lot of the justifications that the industry produces for various policies and things are. Like, as he can kind of see like, well, what are they using as a basis for this? Oh, that doesn't hold up at all. And a lot of it is just trying, like, you're talking to like millions of people. You're trying to make sure people don't panic. People end up making the right decision. You know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so they're just gonna say what they feel they need to say, regardless of what the actual facts are. Like, they're not gonna say like, well, it works kind of, sort of. There are some problems, but you should probably get it. Like, that's not what you want to hear, right? When it's like, here's a vaccine. So I think he tends to like look at that kind of stuff, and that drives him nuts too, which is like fair enough.
Yeah.
But you know, it is what it is.
Yeah. So I would say maybe maybe I'm not sure what the Maoist angle. I'm not sure how I would play that. I think maybe something like I don't know. A lot of these vaccines that like third world countries are getting and stuff like, or like, you know, developing whatever countries are these other vaccines that are lower efficacy, and you know, that is also, you know, or not getting them at all or whatever, you know. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I feel like that's, if anything, is going to have the negative reverse effect of it, of killing off a lot of the rural populations of certain countries and stuff, making it harder to operate in the wilderness and stuff. And it's almost like maybe like the vaccines that are being produced by, you know, the Oxford one and the Chinese one and the Russian one and stuff. Maybe they're like targeted anti-Maoist vaccines, but to get rid of people in the countryside so that they can control the cities.
That would be cool, I guess.
No.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. If you like this episode and you'd like another episode every week, you can get that by subscribing to our Patreon. You Can't Win on Patreon. If you want to send us questions, you can do that by going to the Twitter account @YouCanWinPod, @YouCan'tWinPod, and you'll find a link to the Curious Cat in there, and you can send in those questions. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
See you guys. Bye.